Okay, let's go ahead and get started for this afternoon. Welcome, everyone. My name is Jeffrey Smith. I'm the director of the Center for Business Ethics in the Albers School of Business and Economics at Seattle University, and I want to thank everyone for stopping in this afternoon for this second keynote event of Albers Ethics Week. Many of you might have been here on Tuesday as well. We're going to continue the conversation today. As many of you know, Albers Ethics Week is a week-long intensive examination of ethical issues in business where we have dozens of people from the greater Seattle business community stop by into Albers classes across the curriculum to engage in a discussion of ethical themes, ethical issues, cases, and experiences that help to integrate the study of ethics across the curriculum in the Albers School of Business and Economics. Today's public event obviously is a continuation of our discussion about the effects of COVID-19 and our understanding of responsible business and responsible business practices. Professor Michael Santoro from Santa Clara University is joining us today, and I will introduce him in a few minutes. But I just want to acknowledge at the outset that we're in some ways turning a corner with respect to the pandemic in some communities, but in many others, we're now reminded of the fact that the pandemic is still very much with us. And our thoughts go out to those across the world, especially those right now in places like India that are still grappling with and suffering through the pandemic. Today's conversation, I hope, will eventually come to the topic of the global experience of the pandemic, not just here in the United States, but also thinking about things globally. Today's discussion is going to be just that. It's sort of a virtual fireside conversation between Professor Santoro and myself. And we're going to explore sort of the dynamics and inner workings of the pharmaceutical industry as it relates to not just vaccine development, but also development of therapeutics. And how do we view the pharmaceutical industry and the availability of medicines in the midst of the pandemic now that we've at least been immersed in it over the course of the last year. So before I introduce our guest, I want to, there are a couple of things procedurally. I want to have the graduate assistant for the Center for Business Ethics, Brooke Carlisle, mention, and then I have some thank yous before I make a formal introduction of Professor Santoro.
Thank you, Professor Smith. My name is Brooke and I am the graduate assistant. If you have any questions throughout our program, go ahead and type them up and send them as they come. There is a Q&A button. If you're on a phone or a tablet, you may have to swipe through a few screens to find that. Along with your question, if you feel comfortable, go ahead and add your name, organization, and title, or if you're a student, let us know. And if you're not comfortable with that, no worries, there is an anonymous option for asking questions. So please send those as they come and we will answer them throughout the program or at the end when we have time. We will have time for question and answer. So thank you all so much for joining us.
Great, and so by way of thank yous, of course, it goes without saying that the numerous faculty that host guest speakers for Ethics Week are an integral part of the program, and so I want to thank them. I want to thank the Dean and the entire team in the Dean's office for support of Albers Ethics Week. It shows you very much how it's part of the DNA of the Albers School to have this annual program in effect and supported at all levels of the organization. And then I also want to thank Jenny Medeiros for providing some administrative support along the way to make sure that all of the wheels were in motion to get things accomplished. And I also have three individuals I would like to highlight and thank from the bottom of my heart, which is first Frank Schranz, an enduring supporter of the Center for Business Ethics and all things ethics at the Albers School. The Boeing Company provides annual support for Albers Ethics Week and has for a number of years now. And they not only provide financial support, but they also provide a number of interesting and engaging guest speakers for our classrooms. And then finally, Brooke Carlisle, who you just met, she will be leaving us at the end of this year. She's finishing up her MBA and she will be going on to bigger and better things. But I want to thank her for all of her support of the program and the Center for Business Ethics. And now, without further ado, I want to introduce our guest, Professor Michael Santoro. I've known Professor Santoro for a number of years, and it's my pleasure to have him here. He's a professor of management and entrepreneurship at the Levy School of Business down the coast at Santa Clara University, and was previously a professor at Rutgers Business School. He's held visiting posts at the University of Zurich, Shanghai, the Shanghai Advanced Institute of Finance, and the University of Notre Dame. And during this time, all of these years, he has sort of done work across multiple subfields in the area of business ethics, ethics in finance, global justice and business ethics, business in China, human rights, and as we'll talk about tonight, ethics in the pharmaceutical industry. He's testified before the United States Senate and the United Nations, and continues to consult with organizations and corporations on a range of ethical issues. He is co-director of the Levy School of Business's Tech to Equity Partnership, formed to help reduce racial disparities in healthcare. And I believe that's focused in the Silicon Valley, if I'm not mistaken. And he holds a doctorate in public policy from Harvard University and a Juris Doctorate from New York University. And I want to highlight that he's an author of a number of different books, but a couple that I want to highlight include China 2020, How Western Business Can and Should Influence Social and Political Change in the Coming Decade, which was published by Cornell, and then Ethics in the Pharmaceutical Industry, published by Cambridge. And a lot of themes that we'll be talking about tonight are sort of broached in both of those books. So welcome, Professor Santoro, to our discussion tonight, or today.
Thank you, Jeffrey. It's a pleasure always to speak with you.
Great. So as I mentioned, your work is broad and far-reaching across different areas, business and human rights, the Chinese business context, and ethics and equitable access to healthcare technology and the like. But one thing that, of course, has been the focus of a lot of your work has been on the sort of ethical dimensions of pharmaceutical research and development. And I'd like to talk about that first, both generally and then with respect to the COVID-19 pandemic. So you've said in the past, quite poignantly, that there's a kind of essential tension in the pharmaceutical industry between access to pharmaceutical innovations and innovation itself. So access and innovation seem to sort of stand in a challenged relationship with one another in the pharmaceutical industry. I wonder if you could sort of explain that essential tension to the audience, and then maybe from there we can move on to some more particular questions.
Sure. I mean, it's good to think about that broadly first, right? Because it's an economic notion, right? And so goods don't grow on trees. Drugs don't grow on trees. Some drugs do, actually, and indigenous drugs just grow on trees. But mostly we have to discover them, and we live in a world of scarcity. And intellectual property and drug discovery is, in essence, an economic invention, which assigns patent protection for 20 years for innovative drugs. And they allow us to have produce drugs. It enables the producing of drugs that we wouldn't otherwise have. Once we have innovation, then immediately there are access problems, because as I've noted, in order to spur on that innovation, you need to incentivize all of that investment and energy that one puts into that kind of discovery. It would be nice if it were otherwise. It would be nice if none of us had to work and we could lay around and just the tree of everything that we want could simply produce everything that any one of us wants on a daily basis. And all we need to do is lay around and like my children and play video games and wait for the things to come with us. But alas, that's not the way the world works. And we need to incentivize these wonderful new things, but no sooner are they incentivized than it creates an immediate tension of access. And I think what's hard sometimes for people to understand is that that's inevitable. It's not like, oh, this particular drug went that way, or this particular thing went that way. Whenever, there are, of course, things that would be invented otherwise, right? And so we would have a steady stream of new things happening because there's a lot of people who are not necessarily motivated by money or fame or any of the things that motivate people to work hard, but we just wouldn't have as much, nearly as much. And in the pharmaceutical industry, it's very poignant. I mean, and the COVID-19 vaccine crisis, I think, puts everything into a beautiful nutshell of a case. Shouldn't use that word to describe something with tragic implications, but from a science, but really what we've had is what I would call a natural experiment in all of this.
Yeah. So you've already sort of anticipated sort of one of my sort of follow-up questions, which was, how has that tension played out in the era of COVID-19? Now, most of us are sort of keenly aware of the fact that we had this very impressive development of a range of vaccine options within, historically speaking, a very short amount of time, comparatively very short amount of time. How do you understand access and innovation either being how do you understand that tension playing out or being amplified or being newly defined or changed in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic?
I mean, we were desperate. I mean, I don't know. I remember giving a lecture last March, and when I explained what the vaccine development process was to my colleagues at Santa Clara, there was like an audible sigh of desperation. Like, you mean it takes that long? You mean it's not going to happen by the fall? And so, I mean, what we just very impressive, I think, is understating it. I mean, we just witnessed a miracle. I think this is something that, this sort of trails off into kind of, in some ways, into antitrust and industrial economics. But I think one of the stories that will emanate from this is the sheer capacity that exists within pharmaceutical companies. I mean, the technique of conducting clinical trials over a global group in across multiple age groups, for example, the ability to manufacture these drugs. So, I think that people often sort of forget about the development part of research and development, and we tend sometimes to overinterpret how important the research part is. Mm-hmm. In this case, I think was not trivial, but the research part was cracked really early by lots of teams with lots of different methodologies. And it was the development part that took the Pfizers, the Modernas, the Johnson & Johnson. And I think the AstraZeneca, for example, is still living under the cloud of what the Oxford scientists tried to do. They thought, well, we're pretty bright folks, and we're good at maths. So, we've come up with this vaccine idea, and we don't want anybody to profit from it. Although it turns out that the people who are working on this, have their own company. So we'll conduct the trials ourselves, and it's an incredible skill. It's not just the statistics, but the protocols to conduct these trials. the manufacturing of these drugs requires such precision. If these companies had not been around to do it, I mean, forget about something that we're hearing a lot about now, which is sort of the incentive question, which I'll come to presently. But just the sheer skill that it takes to develop these drugs, I, for one, am extremely grateful. Even though I've been a critic of the pharmaceutical industry for decades. And Jeffrey, you and I think President Biden ought to be more grateful, I think, than he seems to be about the fact that he spent the whole election season in his basement, and today he can take off his mask. I mean, it's stunning. It's not very impressive, which is the phrase you use. It's a miracle, and it's stunning.
Yeah. So you had mentioned the importance of, well, you mentioned both the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines, and you also mentioned that in the context of the importance of research. My understanding is that a company like Moderna didn't even have a profitable line, a product line. I, of course, don't know what's going to be happening now that the pandemic is hit and that hundreds of millions of doses have been purchased. But the mRNA technology in particular, right, as a vaccine technology, is not something that was sort of invented overnight, right? That you have to go back a number of years with both research teams in both Moderna and Pfizer who were working on that kind of technology, irrespective of the coronavirus itself. And I think that's a good example of how you can't, people don't always appreciate how long the research process is before you even can sort of contemplate the developmental process.
Right, and also the clinical testing, once you've sort of patented something, for example, you don't really have 20 years to get back your investment. You've got maybe 7 or 8, 10 by the time you're done with all of the development and clinical testing. But I thought, I mean, I know that this is like a little bit astray, but I thought where you were going with this is sort of on the, if you want to kind of talk a little bit more about what an invention is, and it's sort of funny, right? Because on the one hand, as you're describing, a lot of this technology is built on knowledge that we already have, right? And it's cumulative, right? And so at the same time, in order to get a patent, it needs to be under the law, novel, useful, and non-obvious, right? So there has to be this aha moment, right? But at the same time, in order to prove that you've had your aha moment, you need to show what's called the state of the art. And so all invention is built communally, if you will. It comes out of a wellspring of prior knowledge, of university research. And so then there's that aha moment. And then after the aha moment, there's, I think, what's the most important moment in pharmaceutical development, which is now let's roll up our sleeves and do something with this. And that's the part I think that people underestimate, because there are many people, for example, who say, oh, the science for this was invented, with government money, and all that is true. But I think where the industry shines is in taking invention and creating a real useful product for it. One which we in rich countries have been very fortunate to be able to have, but people in the global South are still don't have access to it.
We will certainly circle back to that access question, because I think I know you've done some recent work on that, and I want to make sure we sort of understand your thoughts on that. But maybe before we switch to another thing that you mentioned, right, which was sort of the relationship between sort of public support of pharmaceuticals, and in particular, right, the sort of public support that existed behind a number of particular vaccines that we're now using. Maybe more of a slightly more philosophical question, just to sort of round out this discussion about innovation I had a conversation with one of my classes in the fall as we were beginning to get excited about the prospects of having a vaccine. And I think AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson sort of publicly said that until the pandemic passes, they were essentially going to make their vaccines available at cost, that they weren't viewing them as a product line that was going to contribute to their bottom line. Whereas Pfizer and Moderna left the door open, right? They didn't sort of take a strong stand on whether they were going to, as it were, profit from those particular product lines. And do you have any reactions to those differences? I mean, it begs the bigger question: at what point, if you're dealing with a drug that's so instrumental to addressing such a pervasive public health threat, is there ever a time where we think that there's a boundary that should be placed on a responsible pharmaceutical firm to, as it were, voluntarily suspend their interest in profit seeking? Or is this
so there's
how do you understand the context of those two positions?
Sure. I mean, I think actually you've enunciated three things that I wanted to address, but before I do that, I want to acknowledge that when Jeffrey Smith says that he's asking you a philosophical question, you had better put your thinking cap on. So that you had me very wary when you introduced it as such, Jeff. For those people who don't know Jeff, he's really, if not the most respected philosopher, one of the most so in the Society for Business Ethics. So I answer all philosophical questions quite humbly, but I think a few things. Number one, when pharmaceutical companies in particular tell you about cost, I learned a long time in grad school from my advisor, Ray Vernon, don't believe it, because what cost is something that's easily manipulated and is so by pharmaceutical companies. They're dealing with, as you pointed out, expenses that are cost of capital over many years, what's their centralized administration portion, all that sort of thing. I would say, secondly, they learned their lesson from HIV/AIDS, right? And so where among other things, they sued, the pharmaceutical industry did, Nelson Mandela in a South African court, and they tried to uphold their patent rights in the strongest way in the middle of the last really scary pandemic that I lived through, and many of us, of course, lost dear friends to that. And so there's having patent rights, and then there's being kind of reasonable and working with the public with those rights. And I think you're seeing that left and right with the pharmaceutical industry. I mean, there's really kind of no need to regulate them in this way. They're already doing many of the smart things. But then to answer your last question, I would say no, there's never anything where at the end of the process of discovery, the process is that the drug is so critical as it is now that we need to require pharmaceutical companies to forego their patent rights. It's in fact precisely the wrong time to do it, right? Because first of all, none of these companies were motivated by profit. I know these people. I know, like, the profit is going to be very nice for them, but it's part of how they work. But that's the scientists and researchers and executives who go, mostly, not all of them, who go to work every day at the Johnson & Johnsons and Pfizers of the world. They're not thinking, oh, let me invent a COVID-19 vaccine so that we can make a lot of money. They're mostly motivated by the fact that they're trying to do good. But at the end of the day, if there's an access issue, we should pay for it, not the farm. The government is there to pay for it. There's no special reason why the problem of access needs to be solved by the pharmaceutical industry. You don't want them solving the access question. You want the government, you want international action to be solving the access issue, because the next pandemic could start, like we might hear, we might get off this webinar, right? And there might be a news flash that says this variant of COVID or something else next week or next month, it's certain to happen, is going to put us back in the basement again. Yeah. And then, you know, you want a strong, financially sustainable, motivated pharmaceutical industry to take on that next challenge. This is not the time to bloody them and criticize them. This is the time to say thank you very much. You know, we thought we know you're greedy. You know, you're not perfect, but wow, thank you for taking us out of our basements and attics.
So your point about variance is timely. One of our business law students, Ben Jones-Rice, has already fielded a question about variance. Since you raised the question of variance and sort of the response of that, the reality of variance to the virus, do you have a beat on or a sense of whether or not the way that the firms are dealing with the presence of variance or the prospect of more variance has, is it going to be promising to rely on the firms to be able to cope with those variants, or is that sort of beyond your expertise at this point?
It's beyond my expertise, but with all of this, it's all hands on deck, right? I mean, we're lucky to have the pharmaceutical industry. We're lucky to have the CDC. We're lucky to have the National Institutes of Health. We're lucky to have university scientists. You know, if there's one, you know, if there's one thing I've learned about global social problems and just life in general, is that when you work together, when different groups from different sectors work together, that's how you solve global problems. And so the pharmaceutical industry is an important part of it, and I would argue the private nature of it is useful. It's a useful aspect of their character, their for-profit private nature, but this is not to ignore all of the other players in this. This is a time to come together. Great.
Well, so, you know, one of the things that's been on a lot of our minds is sort of how there's been different, I guess, I don't know, success is the right term. There are different measures of success when we're dealing with the pandemic, but a lot of it has been made about the difference between the US, for example, and European experience in the vaccine rollout. And some of this, I think, is attributable to the fact that there had been different approaches to the public commitment regarding the funding of the initial research, the decision to, you know, essentially, even before the drugs had been approved, the vaccines had been approved, to commit to buying so many hundreds of millions of doses. And so there's probably other factors that others have commented on as well. But I'm just kind of curious how sort of the relationship between government or public agencies and pharmaceutical firms, whether or not that has anything to do with the differences that we see, say, between the US and the vaccine rollout in Europe, or are there any lessons that you take away from the public-private interface during the pandemic that you've observed?
Right. I mean, I think, you know, I don't know, can we give credit to he about whom we cannot speak? You know, because the role of government in funding came mostly in the form of prepaid dosages, and both in Europe and the United States. I think that this was the critical government part, because it takes a lot of capital, and there's just, private capital would not have enabled the research that the pharmaceutical industry needed to undertake. It wouldn't have funded it. And so the way it was funded essentially was through prepaid dosages. And this, of course, created the problem that we have now globally, which is that, the United States, Canada, Europe, we're all sitting on about somewhere between 3 and 5 times more vaccines than we need. We've contracted for more, and so the question is, how do you, at this point, where we seem to have crossed the tide in the United States, how do we get this out to the global South? And again, going back to to sort of wrap up with a bow the answer to your question. Yeah, I mean, government had a very important role here in the form of prepaid dosages. That was essentially the venture capital for the COVID-19 drugs. But now government's the problem, as we'll shortly talk about.
Yeah. So you have raised now on a couple of different occasions questions about global distribution. And actually, for the benefit of everyone in the audience, I'm actually going to put into the chat function a link to Professor Santoro's recent seminar that he led at Oxford University on this topic. I think that was to the Faculty of Law at Oxford, where you were talking about some research that you're currently working on at sort of the interface of vaccine access, global availability, and global distribution, and the question of whether or not that access is actually something that's connected to, in some deep way, the fact that it's a human rights violation, right? And so I'll put that up there, and people can, at their leisure, they can go and sort of and look at that work. But we, as you mentioned, we have a steady stream of information now about how what you call the global South won't have reliable access to vaccines until 2023. That's an optimistic estimate. I think in your paper at that Oxford presentation, you noted that only 1% of all the vaccine doses that are now currently available have made it to the 50 most impoverished countries in the world. And so, of course, that means that 99% of the vaccine doses are going elsewhere, most of which to Western Europe, the United States. And the Biden administration and European leaders have clearly said, obviously, what you call in that discussion, they've asserted their national interests, which you call sort of vaccine nationalism. And so how are you, as someone who's trained in public policy, as someone who's been immersed in the work of the United Nations and the World Health Organization, how do you see the prospects for access for the poorer parts of the world? And how do we overcome this vaccine nationalism, which, as you note, doesn't just exist in the United States and Europe, it exists in other parts of the world as well?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jeffrey. First of all, for the people who are here, I will make available to the Albers Institute my latest version of the graph of the chart that I had in that talk. So I have a undergrad student, shout out to Caroline Glazer, who helps keep that up to date. But what it is a list of all of the companies and countries that are working on vaccines and their state of development in terms of how proven they are, what kinds of circumstances are necessary to distribute them. So, for example, as I'm sure everyone knows, many of these drugs need to be kept in controlled climates. Others are more forgiving and therefore more appropriate for the global South. But it's interesting. One of the things that you'll find when you kind of look granularly at this is, for example, China's version of the vaccine, which still has no published papers, no no one knows how safe it is. No one knows how efficacious it is. But the WHO has just adopted it as, quote, approved it. It hasn't been approved, obviously, by the FDA or by the European Medicines Agency. But because of the, the global nature of the pandemic, China is playing its own version of vaccine nationalism, which is, geopolitically, they're in various ways trying to influence the world. And so one of the ways that they are going to influence the world is by kind of giving away their version of this. And so the poorer countries are quite simply going to have access to poorer vaccines. And there's an organization called COVAX, which has been set up. It's a multi-stakeholder initiative intended to purchase drugs and distribute it in the global South. And the amount of money that's been contributed to it by rich countries is just shameful, really. I mean, we are, Jeffrey, you're the moral philosopher, right? We're consumed with our suffering and our fear, right? And so at this it's at this very moment when, you asked me before, is there no pandemic or health situation that would reach the point where the pharmaceutical industry should forego profits? And so I'll sort of flip the question back at you and say, is there no is our suffering and our self-absorbed fear, like, at what point is something so dangerous that we need to acknowledge that it's not just we who are suffering, but people in the global South, who are human beings just as we are suffering in the same way we and our families are suffering? Like, what I think what we were so afraid, and we were delivered from our fear, right? But what did we find out about ourselves during the pandemic? That people care about life more than anything else. We care about living and surviving more than anything else. And when we're put in that situation, we're not exactly generous. We want to blame the pharmaceutical industry for the fact that the global South does not have access to drugs. But the fault is not in the stars, it is in ourselves.
Yeah. So I mean, the problem, of course, strikes me as a problem, of course, that's systematic, in the sense that you have an attempt at global governance that may exist through things like COVAX, but you also have national governments, and then you have pharmaceutical firms, those in charge of research and development of the vaccines, that of course are dependent upon a certain kind of relationship with those national governments. So in some ways, the problem seems so systematic, as a lot of social and economic problems are. Is there any reason to be a bit more optimistic than the 2023 figure that I've seen tossed around before we have global, sort of a more equitable, or a more a deeper sort of access to important vaccines? Or is this a problem that's already been laid, and we're sort of, our hands are a bit tied at this point?
Yeah, I mean, it's just tragic what's happening in India, and it's spilling over into Nepal and neighboring countries, and and because India is such an important part of the drug manufacturing process. So if we were to relax patents, and by the way, many of these companies have already done that. India is one of the few places in the world, other than in the United States, where these vaccines can be manufactured and distributed and they're just overwhelmed right now. I mean, what's happening there is a tragedy, but that is, the tragedy that's happening in India is spilling over not only into Nepal, but it's spilling over into Africa and all of the places that they would normally be able to supply and distribute to.
Mhm.
So, am I optimistic? Yeah, I mean, because I think, as as I always said, I always like that song by John Lennon. You're not the only one. Like, we're not the only ones, right? There are many people who care about this. It's on the agenda. You're having this seminar. Over 60 people are here. I think that if we continue to care and put a spotlight on this, I think it will help. But my big message is stop thinking that the way we're going to solve this is by killing the golden goose of the pharmaceutical industry, and put pressure on government to do what it did by the way, in HIV/AIDS. Like, if you go back to, gosh, another president about whom we cannot speak, believe it or not, if you go back to sort of the early part of the Bush administration, when after we had developed HIV/AIDS drugs in the United States, there was, we committed to paying for HIV/AIDS drugs to be purchased and distributed to the global South. Over $80 billion of drugs have been distributed in that way to deal with HIV/AIDS in the global South. That's what we need now. We need all of the rich countries to step forward. While we're spending trillions on infrastructure, I think that our infrastructure is as much America first as America first, right? Because we don't like in America, we don't like in the United States to spend money on foreign aid, even in this moment when the world really, really needs us, and we could alleviate their misery. We are not thinking big and broad that way about the world. And I think that that's very short. In addition to being, I don't make this, I'm a human rights person, so I don't like to make the argument that it's a win-win, right? I know you don't either, Jeffrey, from reading your work. I mean, you're I think a Kantian to the core, and the idea that we're going to get something out of it if we do this, to me, is not the right way to think about a moral obligation that we have to help the rest of the world. But if we don't help them, it will surely, come back to bite us. But we should do it because it's the right thing to do.
Yeah. I mean, you addressed that point eloquently in that Oxford presentation, which again I'll encourage people to take a look at if they want more detail on the position that Professor Santoro is taking. But it's so hard to witness what's going on in India and to not think about the ways in which you mentioned variance earlier, right? The extent to which this is not viewed as a sort of global problem in a really more systematic way. It really will it will either end, the fear is we'll end success that we're having in the pandemic and dealing with the pandemic, or it will certainly make it something that doesn't go away in the way that we have hoped now for a number of months. It's certainly about win-win. It's certainly about outcomes. This is a public health issue. But at some level too, it's a question of equity and justice, which I think a lot of us are sort of struggling with. There was a question that was raised when you were talking about COVAX. And one attendee noted that it was disappointing to hear that COVAX is so underfunded. Is there a way that can be addressed, or is that something, again, that we are facing a little bit of paralysis on?
By the way, if you hear children crying in the distance, it's my children, and their mom is trying to deal with them alone. So my apologies. for that way. I can assure you we're treating them well, but they seem to be having a bad moment. I mean, this is what really irked me about President Biden's suggestion to the WTO that it would be that the United States would be in favor of relaxation of patent rights, because it was so the wrong thing to be doing, right? Like, it just would seem so easy, right? If the problem were the big bad pharmaceutical companies. And so our president has staked out that position. Our president who campaigned from a basement, who today took off his mask for the first time. I think that this is just sort of supremely ungrateful to do what he did last week, and to not acknowledge that these companies are not the problem. I mean, that, you see this, I know, Jeffrey, in your own work in business ethics, is that it sometimes seems that when people talk about ethics and business, it seems like the simple solution is just always to try to, that business isn't doing enough and they always need to do more, and that it's like a one-way ratchet. And if that were so, our job as business ethicists would be like really easy, right? It would just like, we would be outdoing each other. Our job would be just outdoing each other, trying to ask more and more of companies to do their fair share and more than their fair share. And so I think this is something that I've been coming to in my own work in human rights, and is the sense that human rights problems, and I think this can be broadly said of business ethics problems as well, are more often than not problems that have a combination of origin in business and in government, and we need we need to think more about government responsibility. And I'm glad that the person who asked that question did it from a point of disappointment, because we should be disappointed with what we and others have contributed. But I think we need to start. But I think it's a tough sell in the globalism is a really tough sell in the United States. I mean, America First became a rallying cry for some, and then a point of criticism from the other party. But the truth is, we have a very consistent run of America First, and so, whether you're Democrat or Republican, if you look at what we have put forth as our priorities, it's America First. And the parties may disagree as to what's best for America, but I think that we have a lot of, I think that, again, I'm delving into politics here. So I think this administration, wants to be seen as being more global, but it's really not. It's not investing in global institutions. It's really trying to just become friendly with our, quote, allies. That's not the same as investing in the United Nations, investing in the WTO, investing in the WHO. We're not doing that. And Americans need to, I say this as a kid who grew up in Brooklyn, right? And have been very fortunate in my life to travel around the world, meet with people from around the world, and value so much my relationships with people and getting to know people in so many regions of the world. Walking into factories, meeting people who like work in the things that we refer to as sweatshops. And, I feel the luckiest person in the world to be connected globally and to work with people globally. And that's what I wish for my country, is that we enter the world and Jeffrey, this goes back. I mean, I assigned Peter Singer's essay in my class this year. I'd never done that before, and it was it was very interesting, and it's interesting reading it as well. It's kind of a classic. Maybe you could talk about it some, but I was very influenced by reading it and feeling like how relevant today that essay is. If I can throw it back at you, does that make sense to you?
You're talking about the famine, affluence, and morality piece, right? For those in the audience, this is a very famous piece that you will often confront in a moral philosophy class. Many people probably have already read it, right? Where Peter Singer essentially stakes out a very strong obligation or duty on the part of individuals to forsake a lot of their own standing, wealth, prosperity, up to a fairly high level in order to make sure that others who you may not know personally, nonetheless, are able to receive access to resources to make them better off. And that this is a very sort of big distributed problem, not just in the area of medicines, but in the area of access to all sorts of other resources that we have in the world as well. So without me opining on that particular article, maybe what I'll do is I'll suggest it, recommend it. Professor Santoro is now teaching it, certainly worth our time and attention, but it's a very demanding position, right? That we as a society need to really rethink the allocation of wealth that we have, in order that we both collectively and individually need to reallocate resources to those that are less fortunate.
And these people count. I mean, that's the thing about people. Like I call it the global South, by the way, because that's what my friends from all over the world in the United Nations, that's, the third world, the less developed, like these are all like phrases that, we don't use anymore. People who work in global affairs, it's the safe way of looking at it. It kind of, many of you, I'm sure, have seen the world upside down, and many of these countries are South. And if you just turn it upside down, the world looks very different. But, these people count. I mean, that I think is, for me, the biggest lesson of Peter Singer's essay is that, and the big issue now is that the lives that are being led in these countries, they are the same lives we are. They are people just like us.
Mm-hmm.
And that I think that's why this is a human rights issue. That's why there's a moral imperative. These aren't strangers. These aren't people of, we think, the nations, we think we're tribes. Mm-hmm. We're so tribal. Nations are tribes, and we don't give the same consideration to people in these countries that we give to people that we know. And that to me is the power of Peter Singer's essay, is that they count.
So you've already sort of foreshadowed one of the ways in which you view the problem of vaccine access as a global problem, in that you frame it as a human rights concern, or you think about it. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that, why it is that you think of it as a human rights concern, not just a health concern, not exclusively just a health concern, not just a public health concern, not just a concern about access to resources, but if you frame it as a human rights problem, you immediately open up all sorts of other concepts and institutions and ways of talking about the problem of vaccine access that I don't think we hear about that much in the popular press. And so I wonder, maybe first, if you could talk about your work in business and human rights, and then also why is this an issue that you prefer to frame that way?
Thank you very much for that question, Jeffrey. I got goosebumps as you were asking it, and also the urge to write stuff down that your question elicited. So since this is being taped, I'll have to review it, because I'm sure you'll appreciate this. Like, I've only been working on this for a few decades. I'm just starting to scratch the surface of it, right? but yeah, I think framing it as a human rights problem, I think, whenever you have rights, you have duties, right? So if you say I have a right to something, education, healthcare, free speech, negative rights like free speech, you don't have to worry about who's providing that. You just leave the person alone and they can enjoy their right to free speech. And the issue there is leaving people alone. But if you start saying, I have a right to healthcare, I have a right to education, then the question is, who's going to provide it, right? And I think, for me, I'm very practical about why I frame things as a human rights issue, because once you frame it as a human rights issue, then you can legitimately ask, well, then who should provide this right? And so the quick answer is the pharmaceutical industry, right? But if that doesn't work, then who's left? Well, maybe governments have a duty here to step in. And so this piece that I just finished, I think, sort of is meant to redress kind of, I think, there's been so much emphasis in the business and human rights field, which I've been part of now quite intimately for a few years, on squeezing every last ounce of blood out of business. And we forget that business is part of the human rights problem, but most of the time it's organized governments that take freedoms away from people and that fail to provide things for people. So for me, I'm very much of in my old age, I'm becoming like a pragmatist. And so for me, I'm sorry, I'm speaking to Jeffrey. I think you maybe can clarify for the audience what I mean by that. But to me, human rights is very much a practical instrument for working through these problems. Does that make sense to you?
Right. And so one thing that the audience might not quite know or appreciate, there's a Professor Santoro's done a lot of work in this area on the ways in which human rights standards apply to the decisions and actions of multinational corporations in particular. And there's all sorts of ways in which companies can be involved in either the direct or indirect violation of human rights. And in your paper that you just referenced, Professor Santoro, you mentioned the UN Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights, which was the so-called sort of Ruggie report that, or I guess the Ruggie standards or the Ruggie principles that John Ruggie, the ambassador to the United Nations, that or the appointed designated special representative of the United Nations, was sort of the impetus behind the development of these UN guiding principles. You actually want to entertain the possibility that framework, I can't quite tell, was it sufficient or insufficient for us to think about moving through and dealing with things like vaccine equity and access? Or do you want to turn it back onto the shoulders of individual governments? It's hard to say exactly.
Yeah, I think, again, great question. I mean, I think whenever the United Nations does something, it gets a lot of attention. And so by the United Nations becoming involved in human rights, it brought a lot of attention to it. I don't want to get too much into the weeds for our audience, but if they're interested, I'll make a copy of the paper available. But, the title of the paper is like, so maybe the United Nations is not such a great place to discuss human rights, because think, you need to understand what's happening at the UN right now, right? So the UN is run by individual countries, and the Human Rights Council has, which is some 50 odd members. When the UNGPs were adopted, had both China and Russia were members of the commission, that council that adopted the UNGPs unanimously. So that should tell you right there that there's something wrong with them, right? Because they're all about kind of finger pointing at business, and we don't have a mechanism at the UN level for dealing with human rights violations. right? So the only time like countries can intervene against each other at the UN level is when one country has basically violated physically the sovereign space of another. So the idea of the UN telling another country that your human rights standards are not up to snuff is in the very foundation of the UN a non-starter. But on top of that, and on top of everything I've just described, one of the things that's happened, particularly in the last 4 years under Trump, but it's a bipartisan thing, is that we have ignored international institutions. And I think, Trump was shocked, right? So there was a big issue that happened, when COVID first came onto the scene, there was a lot of controversy over whether it was the Wuhan flu, and Trump was shocked that the US spent 10 times as much in contributing to the WHO as China, but China has so much more influence over the WHO, right? They have been playing this great game of lining up countries, including countries that vote for the director of the WHO, and we're shocked that China has this influence. If people in the United States were to sort of poke around the UN and understand how it operates, it's not shocking at all. And so in the human rights field, that's what we have. It's a big mess, and so I feel that the time has come, to, as hard as it is to hold governments accountable, as a human rights person, I've kind of become my boys are struggling for human rights, I think, at the moment. As a human rights person, I've gone back to I feel it's time to go back to government and maybe take some of the emphasis off of business. Right. So you can see now what COVID, like we talked a little bit earlier about COVID being a case that we can learn from, and what we learned from. And what we learned from COVID is that it's the problem is nations, not businesses.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good kernel to take away. We are we have about 10 minutes left of our session, and I want to make sure I get to a couple of questions that are still lingering in the Q&A box. So if anyone has a question that they haven't typed out in the Q&A box, it's on your lower right part of your screen. Go ahead and send that in. One person is asking whether or not, you've mentioned the example of HIV AIDS and how that was an example of how governments and NGOs and pharmaceutical companies sort of, in some sense, partnered, if that's the right term, to sort of deal with the availability of those pharmaceutical products. Are there other examples apart from HIV AIDS that you would point to that might be good models for ongoing collaboration or improvement in collaboration to get vaccines made more widely available?
I mean, I'm going to say I don't know. And so there's two possibilities. One is I don't know because I'm ignorant of things that are happening. The other is I don't know because they're not happening, right? And so, I mean, one obvious area where there should be this kind of thing is on climate change, right? And I think it's safe to say we're not seeing that kind of collaboration happening on climate change. But that's the obvious area, the obvious imperative where we need to do this. And I'm not gonna, maybe another day we'll, Jeffrey, over coffee or a drink, we can go and compare the climate change situation to the vaccine situation to see how they're so. I don't want to give a facile answer to the parallel tracks that they may or may not be following, but that's the other obvious area where we need each other globally. Yeah. I did want to say malaria is, I want to, if I may take a quick detour to talk about malaria, because maybe it helps people to understand, like when I say, when people say, I don't like the way markets work with pharmaceutical, like what you're describing is terrible. Like, the market, what are you talking about? Why do you want the market to work in the case of pharmaceutical industry? And I say, well, if you don't like, the way I respond is, well, if you don't like the way markets work, look at the world's greatest killer, right? Most people who die in the world die of malaria. It is a disease that, again, I've worked in did a small bit with a global, or a multi-stakeholder organization attempting to do something about malaria in the global south. And the fact about malaria is that it's not a rich person's disease, so there's no investment to create vaccines for malaria. There was some news a few weeks ago that suggests we might get there, but I would say, if you don't like the way markets work in the pharmaceutical industry, take a look at malaria. You'll see where there's no market, nothing works. Mm-hmm. Nothing is getting invented.
Right. Or if you have rare diseases, right? Presumably the development of drugs for rare diseases also faces a similar kind of thing, right? Which is, it takes a certain sort of concerted partnership and the ability to attract capital, not necessarily from the private equity markets, in order to sort of cobble together the ability to fund research and development in the area of rare diseases.
That's why we have special programs that are like not patent oriented in the United States to specifically address those things, right?
Yeah. So another attendee is asking, I guess, a related question, which is, so we've learned a lot from HIV/AIDS, as you've already suggested. What are the takeaways, or what have we learned from COVID-19 that will help us with future public health threats? Are there takeaways that
well,
again, maybe looking for some optimistic outcomes?
I think it's important to acknowledge, and this is why that the pharmaceutical industry didn't just research and develop these drugs. They also learned their lesson from HIV/AIDS. They behaved very badly in HIV/AIDS, and they learned their lesson from that, and they realized that, look, we have these rights, but we need to assert our rights reasonably. We need to relax patents. We need to engage in differential pricing. We can't charge everybody around the world the same price for something. And they're doing that now. I mean, it's a little odd that there's not more attention to this now. And so what did we learn? It's too soon to tell in a way, because we're just emerging from our basements and attics. We haven't gotten, we haven't yet started drinking in the pubs yet. I think we're making progress, right? I think that, but it will be the wrong progress if the voices that are, if the well-meaning people who want to blame the pharmaceutical industry for everything are allowed to tell the lesson of COVID. And that's why, and so I think the lesson of COVID is, whether you like it or not, free markets and private capital work, and they can work in an extremely helpful way in dealing with our happiness and social problems and medical needs. And I think that if you don't take that lesson away from COVID, then you haven't been paying attention. I mean, mm-hmm. they are the pharmaceutical industry, are the big heroes of this.
Mm-hmm. So I think this is a nice way too of going back to our original question about access and innovation. When you frame the ethical problem of access, and you frame it as something that is raised by the process of pharmaceutical research and development, but it's not necessarily only addressed by pharmaceutical firms, that access is itself a sort of multi-institutional ethical problem. that I think opens up a vista for the possibility of all sorts of interesting partnerships and collaborative moves and regulatory moves that sometimes might require that pharmaceutical firms do things like relax patents or think about innovative approaches to supply chain or innovative approaches to pricing in order to help sort of steer us towards solving the access question, but to think of it as just an obligation of the pharmaceutical firms themselves is perhaps not the most helpful way of thinking about it. I think that kernel of truth that you've talked us through today is an interesting one. I see Daniel Corrigan has asked, you suggested that the COVID vaccine issue should be framed as a human rights issue. However, human rights are typically understood as giving people claims against their own government. So would domestic governments be the addressee of people's vaccine human rights claims? And what does this mean in the case of governments in what you call the global South? So I guess a question about whether or not it's helpful to think about this issue as a human rights issue at all.
Yeah, great question. I mean, I define human rights as being rights of such I define human rights as being rights of such importance that they impose correlative duties across international borders. So then the question becomes, so yes, of course, the national government that you're part of owes you these rights, but human rights to me are a very specific historical item. I mean, you can trace them to, you can look at historical antecedents, back, all the way through the Western liberal tradition. But I don't think of human rights. I think of human rights as being a very specific concept arising out, after World War II, when we realized the Nazi atrocities, and 1954, December 10, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was enunciated, and it was very much. So I think of it as having a very specific historical context where rights are imposed, and so then the question is, well, who owes the duties, and that's where we get into kind of.
Yeah.
US, it could be us. They impose duties on us and business too. Business operating in these countries. And
right. Yeah, and if people are interested in this question, I encourage them to go to the UN Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights as a place to begin to talk about the ways in which human rights apply to corporations as opposed to states. So maybe we have, I think you're probably not going to be able to answer this question. It's been up for a while now. You're not a research scientist, so I'm going to guess that you don't know the answer to this question. Is there any connection between the rare blood clots that we saw in Johnson & Johnson and the fact that they used embryonic stem cells?
Definitely. Yeah, I can't. Yeah, that's definitely a scientific question.
Yeah.
I won't even comment on it. But I love the question. I do like. Sometimes you could just leave the question dangling, and I think the audience would be happy to hear it.
Yeah, I think we're still getting a handle on the blood clot problem itself, let alone its underlying causes. So we're at 5:15, which is our sort of promised end point. And I know a lot of people have dinners to get to and families to attend to. And as I said last Tuesday, I have to get ready for class, and my students have to get ready for class as well. We have class tonight. So I want to thank you, Professor Santoro, for taking time to meet with us. People don't know that that's a virtual background, but that very much could be a shot from Santa Clara's campus for those that have been there. It's a beautiful campus. But thank you for spending time with us. And if there's anything that we can, talk about in the future, we'll be happy to have you in as a guest. And it's nice to have you on the West Coast, I will say. which happened a few years ago. You were at Rutgers and now you're at Santa Clara, our sort of peer institution, peer Jesuit institution, and it's good to have you out here. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeffrey. And you should all root for the women's, the Santa Clara women's soccer team, which is playing in the College Cup tonight. Go Broncos.
Okay. Okay, great.
Bye.
All right. So thank you all to the attendees for coming, and we will make available this particular conversation in an edited format on the Center for Business Ethics website. That's seattleu.edu/CBE. We'll get that up as quickly as we can.